Hello, everybody, and welcome.
Hi, everyone.
You sound so quiet, Leona.
I do. I'm usually loud, so I'm trying to rein it in.
Okay. Well, welcome to today's presentation. Today we're going to look at stretching and the importance of stretching before and after your either run or bike ride. Hello, how is it going? It's nice to see you guys. Where's everybody from? Oakville, Welland, St. Catharines. Wow. So unfortunately,
I'm from Winnipeg, and it's usually Winnipeg, unfortunately, for the time I get.
Yeah. So we're joining you from Winnipeg. So welcome. Looks like most of you are all from Ontario. So my name is Diane Bryan. I'm the manager of health promotion here at 17 Wing Winnipeg. And I have the pleasure today of having Leona Bond, the fitness coordinator at 17 Wing, who is going to be doing the presentation on stretching. So I will be handing over the reins to her very quickly. We will be using the chat box for our conversations. I will not be turning on the microphones or the cameras. So if you have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat box and we'll be more than happy to monitor that and get back to you on anything that you put in there. The webinar should be approximately 1 hour. We'll be done within the hour. So it's 2 o'clock here in Winnipeg, 3 o'clock in Ontario. If you're on the West Coast, it's possibly still the morning. So welcome back and enjoy. So if you've missed any of our sessions, here's a list of the sessions that we've had so far with the link to the recordings. So you're more than welcome to take a picture of this page if you want. They're also available on Calf Connection. Right, before we get started, this presentation is the intellectual property of the Department of National Defense. So any reproduction or retransmission of the slides contained in this presentation is strictly forbidden. Some of the topics discussed in this webinar may be of a sensitive nature, not appropriate for children. So we're talking today about stretching. So I think for the most part, appropriate for children, but just be aware if your children are practicing some of these stretches that they're doing them correctly. So we ask for some parental discretion around that. Please understand that people's stories are theirs alone to tell, and anything that is shared by the participants in the webinar on the chat is not to be discussed outside the webinar. So we're invoking the Vegas rule. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing later on the PSP YouTube channel, as well as Calf Connection. So we like to have active participation and encourage you to participate, but if you simply want to just watch, that is totally fine as well. So we're going to start off with a poll. So what is your affiliation to the Canadian Armed Forces community?
Wow. I think this is our highest
attendance today. That's exciting.
Yeah, it's good.
Some veterans, family members, civilian employees. That's very good. A nice mixture of people. We're so glad that you're here. All right, now I'm going to pass it over to Leona. I'm going to turn off my camera and my microphone and allow Leona to do her magic.
I wish I was that magical. Thanks, Dan. I'll be turning off my camera as well. I tend to get a little bit animated when I'm talking and stuff, so I don't want to be too distracting. I may turn it on if required in a little bit as well, though. Training and how to get the most out of your actual training, whether that's some cardio, some strength. And a lot of people, when they think about their fitness routine. They're very focused on those two aspects of it, but flexibility is also a very important component of your fitness and your fitness program, but it's often overlooked, or it's the first thing that people tend to either eliminate or forget about if they're short on time. So just kind of briefly to define it before we start about what exactly is flexibility and why would I want to stretch to maybe improve my flexibility. We're just talking about a measure of how much range of motion you have around a joint. So range of motion is just the degree of movement that occurs around any particular joint. So if I do an arm circle, that's going to be measuring the range of motion at my shoulder. If I do a trunk rotation, that's the range of motion of all the vertebrae of my spine, etc. So thing to remember is that it is specific to each joint. So I can be very flexible or have a good range of motion in one joint, but other joint, maybe not. Okay, so it's not like I'm just flexible or not. It's very joint specific. And some joints themselves are inherently have more range of motion than others. So if I think of your shoulder joint, that's a really mobile joint. So we just have lots of range of motion, and that's just to allow us, to be very functional with our movement, versus something like my ankle or even my elbow that, might move well in one plane of motion, but not so well, rotation or side to side. So key to just remember that range of motion and flexibility is pretty specific to each joint. And also to remember that your flexibility may change from day to day. You might notice that depending on your level of activity, your job that you do, or how old you are, that you wake up one day and you feel like you're very stiff and immobile compared to another day. So it can change day to day. Probably a lot more variation in your flexibility than, say, your cardiovascular capacity or your strength when you're working and training on those consistently. So I wanted to start off by asking you guys, do you engage in a regular stretching routine? So Diane's going to throw a poll up there, and you can just answer yes or no. I like that at least we have some honest people here answering the no. A lot of people don't tend to admit to it. Okay. Good. Okay. Looks like more people do than don't engage in a regular stretching routine. And that might be something like you're doing regular yoga, you're engaging in a very structured routine every day, or maybe you're just stretching in general after your workout to make yourself feel better. Both of those might be an example of a regular stretching routine. So if we look at why do I even need to stretch? What's going to be the benefit or the payoff for me? So there's a few things that we look at here. So we can release the tension in our muscles that we develop during activity. So if you're going out and you're training hard, so maybe you're doing some, a harder run, a tempo run, some intervals, or you're doing like a hard paced cycling activity. After that activity, you might have some residual tension that you've developed in your muscles. And stretching after that activity can help to reduce that tension and, bring your nervous system back down to its resting state, bring your muscles back down to its resting length. So there's no residual tension in there that's going to, maybe cause an injury or hold you back from performing your activities of daily living as you progress through the rest of your day. Engaging in a regular stretching routine can reduce your chance of injury. So if I'm doing some stretching as part of my warm-up, so say a dynamic warm-up before activity, and I'm helping to, free up my maximal range of motion for during that activity, I'm going to reduce my chance of injury, so maybe a muscle tear or a strain during that activity because that range of motion is freed up. But if I'm doing a stretching routine over the long term, and I'm either, increasing my range of motion around a joint or maintaining a really appropriate range of motion, I'm also going to reduce my chance of injury long term and in any other activities that I do. It can also help increase your sports performance. So we think of if I'm, training cardiovascularly to increase my ability to run, I'm improving my cardio capacity. If I'm strength training and increasing strength in my muscles, that's obviously going to increase my strength performance by increasing my, ability to produce power or do speed. But can you think of how having an appropriate range of motion would increase your performance as well? Just wondering if you guys can maybe pop a few ideas in the chat. Give you a couple seconds to type. This one is often stumps people, and we kind of sometimes get crickets in response to this. Hi, Melissa. No worries. All right. So with regards to allows you full effect of the exercise, yes, that's true. And so I'm just going to pop my camera back on here for 1 second. So if I want to throw, say, the baseball, if I only have a limited range of motion in my arm, say from here to here, if I only have that range to generate power through, I'm not going to get much power. That ball's not going to go very far. But if I increase flexibility, so I have a lot more backswing in my arm and a lot more range of motion to produce that force through, that ball's going to go a lot farther. So similar for running, if I'm increasing my stride length, just increasing the range of motion that I can ask my muscles to contract to produce power. That's one way that having an increased range of motion through stretching or flexibility training can actually increase your sports performance. So that's one thing where it can provide a payoff in your actual activity, besides just feeling what you do. Reduces lactic acid buildup. I don't know that stretching would necessarily reduce the lactic acid buildup. I know, like, as you're doing cool down and maybe a little bit of movement with cool down and just keeping your circulatory system going, that'll help to recirculate and reprocess that lactic acid. So that could be how, as part of maybe a bit of movement with cool down into your stretch, might help with that. The last 2 points that I have on the slide here, they're not bolded like the first 3 because this isn't directly related to, say, your cycling or your running. But if we're doing stretching and we're, releasing tension in muscles that might be shorter and tight, it can help us to rebalance our posture by just making sure our joints are sitting in an appropriate and balanced position. And then just increasing the ease of performing our ADLs, which are our activities of daily living. So things like being able to, get down into a squat to pick something up off the floor, reach high above you to put something on a shelf when you're putting groceries away, bend down to pick up your child, to pick them up and deadlift them, maybe put them into the crib, things like that. So it can just make activities of daily living a little easier as well. This is a very common question. When should I stretch? Should I stretch before activity? Should I stretch after activity? Should I be stretching both? Does it matter? What do you guys think? Both. Right on. Okay, we're all on the same page. I stretch after. Yep. After is also a very good time to stretch. So almost a trick question, but you guys nailed this one. Both, certainly before, both, awesome. Yeah, so all of the above. There's reasons that I want to stretch before, and there's reasons that I would want to stretch after. Yeah, so we have before to keep muscle loose and after to make sure not to cramp up. Correct. So just remembering that the intent of my stretching routine pre-activity is going to be different than my intent of stretching after activity. So if I'm going to be stretching before activity, the reason that I'm going to be doing that, as it was stated in our chat here, so decrease resting tension in muscles. So that's just helping to keep our muscles loose and, again, free up that range of motion. So, maximizing my usable range of motion for the activity to come, whatever that activity it is. It can also help, depending on the type of stretching we do, and as part of our warm-up pre-activity, can help sort of activate or stimulate our nervous system to prep it for the activity. So it's ready to be, able to fire a little bit more quickly and react the way that we want it to for the sport or activity that we're going to do. It's typical, but not necessarily just doing dynamic stretching before activity. So dynamic stretching is just stretching that involves movement, or we might do short duration static hold. So maybe just 5 to 10 seconds holding each position to pull a little bit of that tension sitting in the muscles out of the muscles. after activity. So we're looking at returning those muscles to their resting length. So again, kind of related to make sure not to cramp up. So if I've been engaged in an activity, cycling, running, where I'm doing repeated contractions in the muscle over and over and over and over again, or very hard contractions, that nervous system is kind of engaged and it's a little bit, firing, and it's ready to create that contraction again. If I lengthen it out and do those nice long sustained holds, I'm going to help return that muscle to its resting length and kind of calm down that nervous system so it's not ready to engage or ready to fire again. This is where we're looking at creating a more lasting increase in our connective tissue length. So that's all of the sort of non-muscle tissue that is surrounding your muscles. So the connective tissue that runs through your muscles and holds it all together, moves into being part of your tendons and then attaches into the bone. So we're looking at creating a more lasting increase in length in that tissue for that long-term increase in flexibility or range of motion. So this is where we would be doing that static stretching, or just getting into a position and holding it for 20 to 30 seconds, or even sometimes more. So this slide is kind of a side-by-side comparison of the two when we talked about the dynamic stretching versus the static stretching. So the dynamic stretching, this one is the one that involves movement. So can you guys think of what an example of a dynamic stretch would be that you might do pre-activity as part of a warm-up before you go for your run or before you go for your bike ride? High knees, right on. Yeah, butt kicks. Looks like Christian has been in some unit PT maybe, or those are ones we often do as part of our unit PT. Yeah, hip openers, absolutely. Sports. Okay, it's for sports. Got it. Actually, yeah, very, very good warm-up dynamic movements for football as well. Good. So when we're doing any of those movements, so we might also think of things like arm circles, trunk rotations, etc. When we're initiating movement, we're going to be starting with a smaller range of motion and gradually working into a larger range of motion. So I'm not going to go, for the high knees right up to the chin, or the butt kicks right up to the butt right away. I'm going to start maybe with a smaller range of motion, and maybe starting with a slower movement at first, and then progress to get gradually more and more within that range of motion, and then maybe a little quicker with those movements, so that they, at the end of my dynamic warm-up or dynamic stretch that I'm doing, they're almost mimicking the exact movements I'm going to be doing for the sport. So again, dynamic stretching, this is, it says usually, but almost pretty much always done pre-activity as part of your warm-up for the activity. And then the static stretching, this involves those stationary holds, or static positions as it is called, held for the longer durations, 20 to 30 seconds or more, intent to lengthen the tissues and cause that lasting change in flexibility, and usually done post-activity. Here we say usually because we did mention before that we might do some of those static stretching holds of a shorter duration, that 5 to 10 seconds, prior to the activity. All right, so since we're talking about prep for our Army run or a Navy bike ride, and running and cycling are kind of our main activities, can you think of some good dynamic movements to do before your run? And so I've put that picture there of that running stride kind of intentionally, because if you look at that picture, you can see the positions that some of the joints are going through. So the knees, the ankles, the hips, the arms. So we've got, our shoulders, our elbows in varying positions. So if we think of the muscles associated with that might need to be warmed up in preparation for that movement, what might be some of those movements you might want to include as a dynamic stretch? Yeah, skips, lunges. Awesome. Absolutely. Skips are good too. Those are going to warm up the ankles, because the ankle does go through that motion as well. Some toe touches. Yeah, so Zachary, I don't know if you mean toe touches leaning forward or toe touches as in like kicking forward, like a Frankenstein walk, but you could use either of those, right? Because like the Frankenstein walk, that's going to be kicking up towards your hand. That's going to stretch out that hamstring, the glutes, and obviously those are going to be used and lengthened out through that stride. What about for cycling? This is almost a trick question. Same, right on. Christian's nailing these ones. Awesome. Hip openers. Yeah, walking. We don't often think of walking as anything as part of a specific warm-up, but it is. It's a dynamic movement. We're putting multiple joints through a range of motion in that lower end of the range, but again, very appropriate for that starting point. Hip openers, absolutely. A lot of hip motion that goes on with cycling. So you can see there's absolutely overlap here. So, and this is part of what I want you guys to think about when you're doing your warm-up, whether it's for running, for cycling, for any sport. Don't think like this is a running stretch, this is a football stretch, this is a cycling stretch, because they're applicable across many different activities, and it's kind of related to the movements you're going to be doing that in that activities, and also related to maybe your body and where maybe you need more focus because of perhaps, you know, you're tighter in a certain muscle or joint, or you've had a previous injury there. So what about after? All right, yeah, quad and hamstring stretching, absolutely. I mean, those are the main drivers of both of these activities, right? So what about after our run? What are some static stretches we might include? So these are the ones we're going to get into position and hold. Yeah, seated toe touch. So that one's going to get your hamstrings. Absolutely. Calf stretch, Michelle, for sure. I know after a run, my calves very definitely welcome some thorough calf stretching because I've actually had some previous injuries in there. And so it feels wonderful. And it's an area that for me is obviously one of concern. Butterflies. Yeah. So that'd be sitting, if I'm thinking of the right one, with your bottoms of your feet together in front of you, knees out to the side. So a good groin stretch. Right on. Good. So I think what we have here, so this is, there's a couple of slides here. I've also scanned these onto a PDF that we have as handouts. But maybe before Diane cues up these ones, I don't know how many of you were attending the one of the previous Race Ready series where Donnie and I were here together, and we had a little handout that actually outlined a very basic dynamic warm-up routine that would be, again, applicable for running and for cycling. And so if Diane could get that into the handout section. So these are labeled sample warm-up exercises, and these are part of a dynamic warm-up and would be considered like dynamic stretches. By no means is this an exhaustive list, but you'll see that a lot of the exercises that you guys mentioned are actually on this list. So we've got like the hip openers, opening the gate, closing the gate, the walking lunges are there that were mentioned, the butt kickers, the high knees. So those are all absolutely appropriate and applicable for part of your warm-up for those dynamic movements. What I've also put in here as well are some of the stretches for running and cycling. So this book did separate them into cycling-specific stretching routine and a running-specific stretching routine. But you'll see that there's actually some overlap on these as well. So Diane's going to pop up. There's the first one if you guys wanted to download the cycling stretches. So this one is saying stretching for before and after cycling. So we can just remember that the stretch and the stretch position isn't necessarily a pre-cycling stretch position or a post-cycling stretch position. It's a matter of, again, our intent. So how long am I holding that stretch, and what am I hoping to accomplish with it? So if we kind of just look at them as they're numbered to sequence us through a bit of that stretch. So we've got some shoulder shrugs. We've got, a lunge position where we're intending to stretch the quadriceps and hip flexors through there a little bit. They've got the forearms being stretched in that slide number 3. In the 4, we're going a bit through the lats, down into a bit of that tricep and through the shoulder, posterior shoulder. Number 5, there's our butterfly stretch that Christian mentioned. So you'll be stretching a bit of your groin in that position. And also because of that lean forward, they're looking at stretching through the low back and a little bit through the glutes there as well. And number 6, then there's a bit more through the glutes and that side of the hip there. Number 7, so that's just basically lying on your back and extending your toes and you're pointing your toes, arms overhead and stretching through to get a bit of the lats and stretching through just right from the hip flexor through the front of the body there. 8's going a bit for the upper back. So you can see all of these muscle groups that we're targeting, these are either muscles that we're using as main drivers in the activity of the exercise, or because of my posture on the bike, that these areas might get tight. So when I think of, say, stretch number 4, and we look at, okay, well, we're stretching through the lats and through the shoulders, but when I'm cycling, I'm using my legs. Why am I stretching my lats and my shoulders? Well, if you think of the position that you're in on the bike and you're leaning forward and your arms are a little bit extended forward, but you're staying static in that position with your hands on the handlebars, or maybe you're in the aero bars and you're crunched over and you're in that position for the duration of your ride, you're going to get tight from sitting in that position the entire time. So that might be a good one when you're thinking of your intent afterwards to spend a little bit of time stretching out because of the effect of the posture of the activity you've been doing, not necessarily that muscle is fatigued as your main driver. So if we look then onto the right-hand side of the page, getting more into the lower body stretches here. So these are the ones that have probably built up some tension in them from long duration use and being the actual drivers of your exercise. So we've got number 9 there working through some of the hamstrings, glutes. Number 10, side of the hip. So a little bit of your piriformis or your rotators in your hip, your glute medius and minimus. Number 11, focusing more on the hamstring. So number 9 and number 11 look a little bit similar. With your knee bent in number 9, you actually don't have a lot of tension on your hamstrings. So your main focus is going to be stretching out through the glutes in that one. Number 11, as you extend that knee, you're going to be lengthening that hamstring out a lot more and feel more of that tension in the hamstrings. And if you guys actually get a chance to get on your back and try the difference between those two positions, you'll really notice that as a difference for where you feel the focus of that stretch. Number 12, that's a version of a sideline quadricep stretch. So definitely using a lot of the quads as you're cycling. 13, using the bike as a bit of a brace to go through the calf stretch. 14, they're doing a standing version there of a quad stretch. So you may feel one a little more than the other, may choose just to do one versus the other of those. 15, that's a good low back and glute stretch, again, using that bike as a brace. And then number 16, looking a bit again through the lats and shoulders. So 16, very similar in position of your shoulder joint as number 4 over on that left side of the page, just using a different position. So you may find one that's more comfortable than the other to get that stretch in. Do you guys have any questions so far? If you can, feel free to pop them in the chat if you do, or questions or comments. None. You're a silent bunch. All right, so I've scanned a similar page for the running stretches, and you'll probably notice a lot of these are similar, if not exact same as some of the ones from cycling. Again, because they're not necessarily activity specific, they're muscle group specific, and that might be, the similar main driver from the activity that we're doing. There are a few that are different. So if Diane can pop that one into the handouts as well. Let's see eventually if that one can get up. So you can see, again, those shoulder shrugs and possibly rotations are going to be one that we can use. And if you think in running, that arm swing as you're swinging, you know, forward, back, that's a little bit of repetitive shoulder motion. And sometimes we tend to, you know, if we're not running correctly or if we're not relaxed, shrug those shoulders up and carry a bit of tension in our shoulders. And that doing those shrugs up and down or that rotation can help to just sort of reset that shoulder posture and cue that proper posture for when you're running. And also there's a lot of just repetitive jarring and bouncing through the shoulders as well. So just making sure you're giving those a good warm up as part of your dynamic stretch in the beginning. That would be one that you could include. And then number 2 there, we've got sort of a side bend. So we could be doing that as a side bend and hold, or if we wanted to make that a dynamic movement, it could be a side bend to one side, coming back to center, side bend to the other. So working through the lats and through the shoulder there, and with the arm bent, a little bit of that tricep. Number 3 is kind of opening up through the chest. So, you know, as we're running with the arms driving forward a lot, we tend to kind of tense up or roll those shoulders in. So that's a good way to sort of free up and open up that chest motion, just to make sure that, you know, the arm is freely going to be able to swing on the backswing and that we can have that appropriate posture upright when we're running. Number 4, we've got, again, a calf stretch, similar like in the cycling. There's a standing quad stretch on number 5. Number 6, this one, we're going to get a little bit of calf and Achilles in number 6. More kind of lower down focus in the calf, but doing this is also going to work a little bit of warming up the actual ankle joint itself. So if we're doing that kind of as a slight knee bend and then back up, feeling a bit of tension through the back of the Achilles, and it's going to warm up that ankle joint, which will be really great for running. So we might start with those and then progress maybe into some of those skips that were mentioned before once we've got that ankle joint warmed up a little bit initially. So this is a version of a standing toe touch. So we're going to be hitting a little bit of the low back, the glutes, the hamstrings in that one. That number 8. So in the cycling, we were doing a standing version of a lunge position, hitting a bit of that hip flexor and quadricep. This one is a little bit of a more intense version. We've got a larger split or stance in that lunge, but again, just working through the hip flexors and the quadricep position. So if you think of that running stride, as your foot plants and then the leg back swings behind you and the knee is bending or flexing, that's a lot of stretch through that quad and through that hip flexor. So you're going to be doing this position before your activity to help free up that range of motion. And again, just so that you can maintain proper mechanics when you're running, and you're going to reduce your chance of injury. And then on the second page there, so these very familiar from the cycling one that we did. So we've got, again, number 1, we're doing a bit of a calf stretch, the lower portion, so maybe the soleus muscle and through the Achilles there complex. So that's something that would have been very, very active while we're running. There's our butterfly stretch that Christian had mentioned before. It's got the highlighted blue section, so showing through the groin and adductors where we're going to be stretching out. One for the side of the hip, so your glute medius minimus, your glute max. So those are kind of hitting all of those in that position. We've got another sideline quad for number 4. Number 5, again, working through the glutes and maybe a bit of the upper region, focusing hamstrings. And then number 7, with that knee straight and the toe coming back towards your head, we've got kind of more focus through the hamstrings and intensity there. Number 6, the intent of this one is just to stretch through your upper back. So again, depending in your running, sometimes we'll get that tension going through the shoulders, through the neck. So this can be a way just to release some of that tension that might have generated through your run or through your activity. And number 8, this almost looks like a Shavasana position from yoga. Again, where you're on your back and you're just extending your toes and your hands as far apart from each other and doing kind of a general front of body stretch. So this one, I believe, was on the cycling page as well. So especially in cycling where you're very forward flexed and kind of closing everything off on the anterior side of your body, this is a great way to counter that out and stretch it. Same with running. We tend to be a little bit of a forward lean in running. And if we think forward focused with, you know, that knee coming up, the arm swinging forward, this is a good way to just sort of release the tension anywhere in that front or anterior of the body. Before we go on to this one, can you guys think, or do you guys do any additional stretches besides the one that we've listed? Or can you think of another area that you add in that you think is really appropriate for after you run? Foam rolling, yes. And that is one thing that, so I didn't put anything specifically, downward dog, IT band, heck yeah. So I specifically didn't put anything in here with foam rolling or specific other types of stretching like PNF stretching or other styles of stretching or mobility exercises, because there's a whole host that we can talk about. But foam rolling for sure can really help with sort of adding to your stretching routine, because the intent of that is to actually physically manipulate that muscle tissue and that fascia that surrounds all your muscle tissue to help make that a little more pliable and malleable. So I don't know if you guys have ever tried doing a bit of the foam rolling first. So maybe on that IT band, which is, a very thick band of connective tissue that runs down the side of your leg on the outside. If you foam roll that first to loosen it up, and then go into your stretch, you might find that stretch is way more effective because you've really kind of loosened it up. And I see Diane popped in there. It finds muscles that I didn't know existed. So yes, it's definitely not the most comfortable practice, foam rolling, because when we have tight spots or maybe some adhesions or restrictions in our connective tissue, it's not comfortable and can be quite painful. But the good thing is that pain does tend to subside the more that you do it and the more often that you do it, as those restrictions release and you actually work on kind of increasing the pliability of that connective tissue. So what I think I'm going to do, I have an image here since we were talking about it. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Perhaps not. All right, can you guys see the image of the muscle right now, Diane, or no? No. We practiced this. All right, no success. That's okay. What I did have was just a diagram of muscle, sort of a cross section of it, because most people think that your muscle is just muscle tissue in there and that's it. But the reality is, in addition to the muscle fibers, which are the actual fibers or the red part of your muscles. So if you think of when you have a piece of raw meat or a steak sitting on your plate, before you cook it, the red part is all of the muscle fibers, or that part that actually does the contracting and lengthening to provide you the power. But there has to be something that holds that all together and that anchors it down to your bones so that it can actually move the bones. And that's connective tissue. And if you look at a cross section of muscle, there's actually a lot of connective tissue that runs through it. And that is actually the part when we're foam rolling, say, and we feel that pain, it's usually the connective tissue that we're looking at lengthening out. Or if we're doing the static holds in the muscle and, we move into our position and we kind of hit that end range or that end barrier, when we hold in that position, we're actually trying to target the connective tissue and that fascia to be lengthening versus the muscle tissue. And there really is quite a lot of it that runs through the muscles. So that's kind of the image I was intending to share, but apparently not tech savvy enough right now to have that happen. All right. Couple of things that I wanted to add just as notes about flexibility for what affects it. Because we did talk a little bit about, it does change day to day. So maybe after a really hard workout that I've done the day before, or, if, it was race day yesterday and I just did my half marathon and I wake up the next day, I probably notice a very distinct change in my flexibility the day after versus maybe my normal state, or when I'm, haven't just completed 13.1 miles. So that might be one thing that could affect it or have it change day to day. But there's certain other factors that do affect flexibility and maybe might affect how I train for flexibility or when I might need to change my flexibility or stretching routine. So age, flexibility tends to decrease with age. So when we spoke a little bit in the beginning and Diane was mentioning, oh, you know, with kids, some of it may or may not be appropriate. We all know it, like for kids, they tend to be very flexible beings naturally. And sometimes I get astounded when my goddaughter gets into certain positions or, you know, I see her just drop into the splits like it's nothing. It seems pretty impressive to me, but kids do tend to be a lot more flexible. And then as we age, we do tend to lose some of that flexibility and our connective tissue maybe loses some of the elasticity. Our connective tissue structure does affect that too. So if we think of the plasticity of our tendons, our ligaments, the joint capsules, fascia, skin, so those are all sort of the non-muscle parts that do affect how much range of motion I have around a joint. So that could be different from person to person, or again, different as we age. The joint structure itself will affect kind of how one joint has more range of motion than the other. So when we kind of talked about before the shoulder joint having a lot of range of motion, because that's a ball and socket, so that facilitates a lot of range of motion versus a hinge joint such as the elbow, which really only moves flexing and extending and doesn't have a lot of other options for movement. Activity level. So active people tend to have more flexibility than inactive people. So that's kind of a testament to the use it or lose it. So if you think of that person who is sitting in a desk-bound job or is in a very sedentary or static position for most of their day, they will just tend to be way less flexible and have less range of motion than someone who is active throughout the day. And that's simply because all of that connective tissue that we have running through our muscles and as part of that anatomy, if we aren't putting it through a range of motion regularly throughout the day, it does tend to sort of sit in that resting length that we put it in and stay there. So if you think of, if you've been sitting for a long period of time in a chair and your hips are flexed, so maybe the connective tissue and even the muscles a little bit in your hip flexors, they're going to be in a very short position. And if you're there for hours and hours and hours and you go to stand up at the end of the day, you'll feel that tension in there and that tightness. So if you can imagine the cumulative effect of being in that position and not moving a lot day to day to day versus somebody who does get up out of their chair a lot more often and maybe does go for that bike ride or goes for that run and they're putting that hip through that full range of motion, they're just naturally going to have a bit more of a range of motion. Or for like a lot of you guys who've indicated that you do engage in a regular stretching routine, that's one way as well that you can increase a bit of that activity level and exposing your joints to the full range of motion every day. Previous injury for sure will affect this. So for an example, I probably a good 15 years ago now tore an adductor when I was trying to relive my gymnastic youth. Turn a cartwheel, obviously wasn't warmed up for it properly, got a tear in one of my adductors or inner thigh muscles. And what happens is when you tear some muscle fibers, your body goes in and repairs it, not with more muscle fiber, but with connective tissue. So it lays down a little bit more of that connective tissue to kind of knit everything together, which is good. It's a strong tissue, but that does mean that's an area that can tend to get tight or get adhesed. So I know for me, that's one area that I need to spend a little bit more time on dynamic warm-up before activity because that's an area of more restriction and tightness for me. And then again, after the activity, just so I can try to maintain some of that resting length in that connective tissue. This is also a good spot, just like Michelle was talking about foam rolling. So if I know that that area of the previous injury has a lot of that connective tissue or scar tissue, which essentially is the same thing in it, then that's one area that I can really work on hitting that foam roller to help keep that area nice and malleable and elastic so that it doesn't become a bigger area of concern for me. And I just stuck that picture in there of that grandma doing the splits because I thought that was pretty impressive. We do tend to lose flexibility as we age, but we don't have to lose all of it. And if we stay dedicated and consistent to actually training flexibility and working to maintain or even increase it, we can actually see a good benefit and effect from it. So that flexibility routine, it might need to change. It can change just as you age. It can change with your type of training or your training state, change with your injury status. It could change with, you getting a more sedentary job and maybe needing to focus a little bit more on it. There's really a lot of factors that kind of go into that. All right. Just wondering if there are any questions. Okay. I have a question for you guys in the chat. For those of you who say you engage in a regular stretching routine, was that both like a dynamic stretch warm-up prior to activity and a stretching routine, like static stretching at the end of your activity? Or is it sort of just one or the other, or I do yoga? Physio exercises. Yeah, before stretches, before and after. Good. Yeah. Stretching after running. Okay, that's good to see, because it's, there's a benefit before and there's a benefit after, but the reality is that sometimes we don't have enough time. So you can even think just knowing the intent of each of the stretches is like, okay, I've got my warm up that I regularly do for my run. I know some of that is inherently a dynamic movement and warm up. So I'm going to focus time at the end of my run doing static stretching, because I feel like for me, I need to be increasing range of motion because I know I'm tight places, and that's totally fine and acceptable. I notice a lot of you involved in indicating physio exercises as well. So I'm thinking that might be related to having some previous or current injury. But that's good. Often stretching will be a big part of that to help you maintain, again, that functional range of motion and prevent any further injury. I have to agree with Diane. Christian looks like a very good role model and a knowledgeable role model. It looks like you're very knowledgeable on the stretching, and you're also very consistent with doing it, which is a good thing to see.
Well, and you're getting the people that you're working out with doing them too, so that's really
obviously
good.
Motivating a lot of people. Have the section. Perfect. Yeah. So if
very, very nice.
Yeah, I have to say that's
awesome,
a huge
Christian.
thumbs up. That's great. And if you guys have any questions, not just now for within the presentation, but if you have any information, maybe you're looking for a little bit more information on stretching, or even just a bit more information on foam rolling, or looking at different types of stretches, or anything, feel free absolutely to reach out. I've got both of my emails there, my Forces email account, also a Gmail account, because I'm not in the office 100% of the time. But absolutely feel free, reach out, and I can help you with any questions or resources if I can help you, direct you to.
Does that answer your question, Christian?
How do you get, yeah. Probably, Christian, the best way, just because I'm not always in the office, so it would be hit or miss if someone's trying to get in touch by phone. So what you could do is reach out by email, and then we could either set a time to connect by phone, or if it's specific information or resources that you're looking for, it could help you track that down. Because I know we at our base do like personal programs for military members, for the military that are in our area of responsibility, but depending where you are, could help you track down what contact might be local for you to do that as well. I like that Catherine mentions the Nike training app has a great 7-minute warm-up video. There are a lot of different apps, even on YouTube videos as well, that you can search for dynamic warm-ups, sport-specific dynamic warm-ups. It's it's incredible how many there are out there. So yeah, I've seen the Nike training one, and yeah, there's a lot of good content on there.
And 7 minutes isn't all that long.
But if you guys remember, if you were part of the webinar previously, 7 minutes, that's absolutely, if you're doing that in addition to a few extra minutes of just some general, walking into light jog and then into that 7 minutes of specific warm-up movements, that's a very appropriate amount of time to be part of a good dynamic warm-up. So.
Super. All right. So just our standard resources slide is next. So should you be struggling with anything, please feel free to contact any one of these numbers. Canadian Forces Members Assistance Program, CIFMAP, 1-800-365 days of the year. Free confidential service for military members and their families. This is also the same number that civilian employees would use for their EAP program. Canada's suicide hotline number. So if you or anybody you know is considering suicide as an option, please have them contact this number to get them the help that they need. If you're looking for information on COVID-19, go to the direct source, go to the Government of Canada source. Probably much more accurate than what you would get off Facebook or Twitter. Family information line is a 1-800 number, again, 365 days of the year, bilingual service that has actual counselors on the line. So for you, your family, extended family members can call this line and get the help that they need. The Sexual Misconduct Response Center is there for all things of a sexual nature. Kids Help Phone is there. Parents can also phone this line as well to get some advice on parenting too. So great resource. The ARC line in support of COVID-19 is all things COVID-19 for the military. And then final poll. As soon as I find it. There we go. So do you feel that you can apply what you learned today to your daily living? How did we do? Super. Okay. So a couple people maybe don't think they can use it, or they hit the wrong number. That sometimes happens. Yeah, I thought that might happen.
I think we've had...
That's okay. Not a problem.
I think we've had that happen in every presentation.
And sometimes when I'm typing them in, I type them in the reverse order too. So that
was our second trick question of the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're not doing that. So this is a list of the upcoming sessions that we have left. So there are 5 more sessions. Next week, we're going to be talking about maintaining that motivation, especially now since many of us are back at work and not necessarily working from home. So how do we rejig or maintain that motivation once our schedule has changed? Then we'll be looking at mental toughness, so getting across those barriers while we're trying to finish either our marathon or our bike rides. And we'll look at stepping up training, injuries, and then finally the very last session, we're going to look at celebrating our success. And we'll be having a lot of the presenters that we've had on this whole series for questions and answers. So if you've got something that you really wanted to know from one of our previous sessions, is a great time to come on for that one. And
yeah, I'm actually excited for that session as well, because I think there'd be a lot of good questions, and like to see how everyone, was able to apply everything from the series and see how that contributed to their success.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments before we sign off?
I find that comment interesting from Florence saying motivation is excellent from home. I'm exactly the opposite. I find it very hard to stay motivated at home, but now that I've been a little bit more back in the office and gotten my routine back a little bit, it's easier to fit the training and even the stretching and the mobility work in.
I think I'm more like Florin. Much busier, much more able to do the things I need to do at home than having to do them when I'm at work.
I think I want to play with my dog all day is just what happens when I'm at home. So
okay. That makes sense. Nice, Flora. Well, it's nice having you here today, Florin. We've missed you the last couple, so glad you're back.
Probably be a good contributor to our maintaining motivation one next week, that's for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we will hopefully see you sometime in the next coming weeks, either next week or one of the remaining weeks that we have. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.